Welcome back. First, this is not about zombies. I apologize. I know. Let me apologize also if this talk is a little rambling. At Rev G's request, I threw this Jeremiah together over break between second helpings of turkey and separating two brawling boys. I'm also going to take a huge risk later, and I'm really worried about it. So we all have my discomfort to enjoy. As a sort of last-minute talk, I'm just going to mull over an idea that keeps forcing itself into my thoughts. It's about the difference between public space and private space. It's about the idea of the commons, that space, physical and otherwise, that we share together. At first blush, this seems self-apparent. The difference between your dorm room and your classroom seems pretty obvious. You have some measure of privacy in your dorm room or your bedroom at home that obviously doesn't exist, say, here in Bingham. The school reinforces this idea by requiring dress codes, by prohibiting cell phones in the halls, effectively saying that we expect different conduct in different spaces. Yet, this is an inherently difficult idea for adolescents, I think. And it's because you're egocentric. And don't take that the wrong way. You're supposed to be egocentric. It was probably just a few years ago that you realized you're the star of your own movie. You write the script, you perform, you weather the critics. This is part of how you differentiate yourself from your childhood self. That part of you clinging to your mother's warm, dry hand. That part of you hiding behind the mass of your father's legs. Your world revolves around you. Even most altruism is simply someone playing the role of an altruist at first. Maybe it becomes the person's true identity, maybe not. But as you define yourselves as human beings, your focus is naturally on yourselves, which can sometimes blind you to the fact that you share the planet with other people. The best example of this inability to recognize the difference between public and private space is profanity. I don't have a problem with profanity per se. I use it. I don't blush when I hear it. But especially when I added two impressionable young children to my life, I had to come to the realization that my words, once they leave my mouth, belong to everyone who hears them. Similarly, when you speak in class, for instance, your words belong to the class discussion. The formulation of ideas that you put into words is now a part of the shared experience of the class. I think we understand that. But when you walk down the hall and drop an F-bomb at the top of your voice, that's also a public space. Again, I'm not a squeamish prude, but I have come to realize that public spaces belong to all of us. That includes the person who doesn't want to hear your creative use of compound profanities. This isn't about political correctness, although I'll talk about that in a moment, but rather about simply sharing the common space of our community with dignity and class. Some expletives are unplanned. The inevitable stubbing of toes, the misplaced hammer blow, the sudden reception of shocking news. But that's not what one hears in the halls around here. Instead, it's just a reflexive use of profanity, because that's what you hear and use in your private space, and it bleeds over into the commons. Take two examples of how pervasive profanity's become in the last 15 years or so. George Carlin had a classic routine about the 7 dirty words you can't say on television. Now, humor and profanity are both transgressive. They get their kick from the fact that you're not supposed to say or do that. And in saying a curse word or performing a practical joke, you violate some small rule. And that's what gives life its spice, its frisson. But overuse that license, and you destroy the tension that goes into using profanity or making a risque joke. 3 of Carlin's 7 words are ubiquitous in basic cable after 10 p.m. every night of the week. 1, what's called the S word, was the topic of a South Park episode a few years ago. They even had a little counter at the bottom of the screen where every time Cartman said it, it rolled over to a new number. I think they hit 200 in a 30-minute episode. The South Park guys were making fun of our squeamishness over profanity, but they also demonstrate that once you overuse a word, it ceases to have any power, subversive or otherwise. Put another way, what started out as subversive and creative became overkill and boring. It's not just out-and-out profanity either. I'm going to go ahead and use these next 2 words as is, no euphemisms, and I apologize to any and all who take offense. This is the part where I get uncomfortable. I want to talk about bitch and nigger. There was a school of thought that blacks and women could use those words in such a way as to remove the sting from them. It was a form of co-optation that allowed them to use a word that for centuries was a verbal form of oppression and abuse and strip it of its ability to gut punch someone. I remember living in LA in the early 90s and a friend of mine walking me through an NWA song. The use of profanity and racist words had a point. It was an expression of political rage. It was searing. A few years later, Meredith Brooks had a hit single called Bitch. It is now almost impossible to find an entire rap album without someone using the N-word. But I would argue that the theory of using a word to strip it of its power ultimately doesn't work. Instead, it is simply allowed license for people to use that word. I know what NWA was trying to do, but 20 years later, I don't think it has worked. A lot of energy went into making the N-word, into making it something that was simply not okay to use under any circumstances. Hopefully, a middle-aged white guy saying it makes you feel uncomfortable. But when I'm in the weight room and the music constantly drops the N-word followed by an F-bomb, that's a violation of public space. As a history teacher, I don't want my country to be a country where it's okay to call someone that word. Too much blood was literally spilled in order to end the idea that some people can label other people. And if I hear it, I'll turn it off, because it's not just a word. It's a word that was used for centuries to say that some people were better than others. And that obviously goes for any type of slur. To be clear, as far as I know, TAF students don't go around calling each other the N-word. But I've heard you call each other gay, and it's the same thing. But even if we don't use the words ourselves, if we blast music out of our dorm window during warm-ups before practice that uses slurs, whether sexist or racist or what have you, we're tacitly endorsing their use. I know that you're the star of your own movie, but your movie overlaps with everyone else's movie too. And there needs to be some basic level of agreement on what theaters show PG and what theaters show R-rated movies. To use another metaphor, if we see someone throwing their garbage out the car window, we understand that they have polluted the common space we all live in. And while the occasional candy wrapper or stray receipt may fall out of your pocket, don't make it a habit of throwing your entire Happy Meal on the sidewalk. This isn't about thought police, it's about courtesy. We live cheek by jowl here at Taft. Most of you will decide to share your life with someone else, share a home with a family. Get used to the idea that being part of a community means putting just enough filter on your words so they don't make others uncomfortable. And that includes nattering old farts like me, apparently. Finally, there is another area where the interplay between public and private life is very tricky, and that's the virtual world. So much of our life happens online, and we haven't yet come up with an etiquette for that world. Some of you know I have a blog. The only people who read it regularly are my mom and a few of her friends. Sometimes I'm used to use profanity because sometimes profanity is called for. It's my blog after all. I'm 45 years old, and if I want to curse, I can. Except my audience apparently consists of not a few 70-year-old matrons in the greater Atlanta area, Deirdre Shea and Angel Pan. So I have to tone it down just a bit. In the end, I have to write as though I was sitting in front of my mom, which means when the S hits the fan, it does not do so gratuitously. And maybe gratuitously is the important filter. And finding out what that filter is, well, that's worth consciously thinking about. Similarly, social media puts you guys in almost constant contact with each other. But think about the physical dynamic of being online. You're usually isolated somehow. You're interacting with a screen, not another person. You lose that filter that naturally occurs when you're next to someone. I've been part of an internet chat group for over 12 years. It's a group of people who started out talking about Braves baseball in an ESPN chat room in the early days of the internet, back in the dial-up era. Now we have our own website, and some of us post daily. I know a little bit about most of them. Some of them have met up at games, met as real people. We have running inside jokes that stretch back over a decade. It's nice. This summer, we let a whole bunch of new people into the site, many of them your age, refugees. There were some new rules of the ESPN board, so they all came over. Immediately, flame wars and personal invectives started flying. The rules and norms of the old-timers, and the old-timers are not that old, most are in their 20s, had put into place were overwhelmed by the internet cultural casual cruelty. It took a month before we straightened it out. And we straightened it out because we all wanted to continue talking about baseball, not calling each other names. But for most of the internet, there is no referee. And without the buffer of looking another human being in the eye when you insult them, much of the internet can be caustic and unpleasant. Not because everyone there is caustic and unpleasant, but because there are usually a few people who would take the commons of the internet and turn it into a swamp. Rather than share a public space with everyone, they insist on colonizing it to their own personal space and filling it with their own unpleasant baggage. And remember this too, the internet never forgets. If you think you can infect some public corner of the internet with your private bilge, remember that it's always out there. Increasingly, companies are checking people's online persona as part of the hiring process. Emails are not as private as you think. The promise of the internet is that it is a commons, a public space for a new century. The peril is that before it becomes the commons, it will sink to the lowest common denominator. It will be about insult and profanity and not respecting the common rights of all to use it. There are endless examples of this inability to differentiate between public and private spaces. People on their cell phones loudly talking about their colonoscopies. Dude, I do not need to hear that. I'm glad the polyp was benign, but come on. The point is not to censor everything you say or think. Political correctness, simply for the sake of political correctness, is both censorship and a power play. I would just challenge you to recognize that your life plays out in public. Not all of it, thankfully, but a lot of your life is there for the world to see. And whether it is what comes out of your mouth or your stereo speakers, or by the deeds you do, and in seeing you, the world will judge you. Not because you make Miss Manners retreat to her fainting couch, but because ultimately you will be judged by the consideration that you show others. Thank you, and good luck these next couple of weeks.